My Lord, ladies and gentlemen, pray silence for the President, Dr. Ian Grimble, Bachelor of Arts, Doctor of Philosophy, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, who will propose the toast of the evening, the memory of Sir Walter Scott.
Mrs. Maxwell Scott, Councillor Mrs. Mansbridge, my Lord, ladies and gentlemen. If there is any higher honour that a consort of Scots is able to pay an individual than to elect him president of this club, I don't know what it is. And for anyone who's not called to this seat from 10 Downing Street, or Mount Olympus, or any of those other places where the candidates for your favour are already short-listed, for someone like myself, in fact, who has somehow reached this eminence by clinging to the coattails of Sir Walter, it's a higher honour indeed. And in the state of euphoria which your compliment has induced, I shall not hesitate to boast of my family's connection with Sir Walter, though only because I want to illustrate his genius for friendship. People may possess the gift of friendship without having any other outstanding talent and still make a larger contribution to life than those who are more widely gifted. This is a truth which Scott never got tired of stressing in his novels. And although he was so richly talented himself, to no talent did he pay greater attention than to that one. My own Scott ancestry stems from Isabella Scott, who married a TV at Dale Shepherd, and whose home in the village of Denham in Roxburghshire is preserved as a national monument, because in it she gave birth to John Leiden. She also gave birth to a daughter, Jean, and the name Jean has been preserved in my family ever since, and it's borne today by my mother's sister, who I'm glad to say is present here tonight. The talents which John Leiden developed were especially apt to be fostered by oral tradition, for want of a well-stocked library. He was trained to read in the Bible, of course, and he later qualified to be a ministry of the gospel. Once he succeeded in borrowing a copy of the Arabian Nights from a blacksmith, and I think that helped to bring him to an early death in a distant and exotic land. Moral: don't let your children borrow books from blacksmiths. Once, of all things, he got his hands on a dictionary of 8 languages when he was a child, and this, I think, certainly helped to produce one of Scotland's most phenomenal linguists. But above all, his mind was filled with the legends and the poetry of the border country. Their language was his language, and it remained so. Once later in life, when he was asked why he couldn't speak English, he, such an outstanding linguist, in the presence of distinguished English-speaking people, he replied, "It was trying to learn that language that nearly ruined my Scotch." Such was the peasant lad who trudged off to Edinburgh at the age of 15 to attend the university here, who proceeded to take one of Europe's most brilliant intellectual centres by storm, and who formed the friendship with Sir Walter Scott, which I want to talk about in a little more detail. As you may have gathered by his response when he was invited to polish up his speech, he wasn't the sort of man who could be intimidated into aping the conventional behaviour of his betters. Scott wrote, "The manners of Leiden when he first entered the higher ranks of society were very peculiar. Neither were they at any time much modified." But Scott was entranced by such peculiarities. It was out of these that he created a gallery of portraits which has no equal in literature, not even in the pages of Shakespeare. Let's look at the raw material which Leiden presented to him as it was described by Cockburn. Leiden, said Lord Cockburn, was a wild-looking Roxburghshire man with sandy hair, a screech voice, and staring eyes, just as he came from his native village of Denham. By the time I knew him, he'd made himself one of our social shows and could and did say whatever he chose. His delight lay in an argument about the Scottish church or Oriental literature or Scots poetry or customs or scenery, always conducted on his part in a high, shrill voice with the greatest intensity and an utter unconsciousness of the amazement or even aversion of listeners. The singer, in fact, appears to have been a good deal less beguiling than the song, and this proved to be true literally as well as metaphorically on one occasion when Scot and Leiden were attending a social gathering, perhaps very like ours this evening, but one at which a singer had been invited to give a recital to what was then a novel instrument, the fortepiano. And what did the guests hear as the performers were being encouraged with the usual polite blandishments to begin their recital? According to Scot, they heard Leiden, who couldn't sing a note, scream forth a verse or two of some border ditty with all the dissonance of an Indian war whoop. After the party was over, as they were going home, Scot ventured to question Leiden about his extraordinary behaviour. And Leiden replied, "Dash it, man, they would have thought I was afraid to sing before them." A remark which fortified me, I must say, when I was invited to address you here tonight. Though I assure you I shall not be attempting to sing. Such was the collaborator of Scot in the compilation of the Border Minstrelsy. And we can still recapture the excitement of those two young men, so different in character, as they set about erecting that marvellous monument to the society for which they shared such a deep affection. Let me remind you of one of Scot's account of their expeditions. We have just completed an excursion of 2 or 3 weeks through my jurisdiction of Selkirkshire, where in defiance of mountains and rivers and bogs, we have penetrated into the very recesses of Ettrick Forest, a reminder of how inaccessible a great deal of the border country was in those days. In the course of our grand tour, besides the danger of drowning and breaking our necks, we suffered the formidable hardship of sleeping upon peat stacks and eating mutton killed by no common butcher, whatever that's meant to imply. The chief result of our inquiries is a complete and perfect copy of Maitland and his Old Baird Grey. You may imagine the surprise of Leiden and myself when this was presented to us, taken down from an old shepherd by a country farmer. I think it's a great pity that that association was so short-lived, especially as Leiden began to take an interest in the Gaelic Highlands, and this was an area in which he could have given Scot a lot of help and advice. But he was having difficulty in obtaining a charge in the ministry, which is perhaps not surprising. And the African adventures of James Bruce of Kinnaird, and more recently Mungo Park, who had recently come back to Selkirk, began to fire his imagination. Scot complained, "Leiden has taken the most absurd resolution to go on a voyage of African discovery. I'm certain he would obtain a church in Scotland with a little prudence and patience. And he gives me," you saw the provisor, "and it gives me great pain to see a valuable young man of uncommon genius and acquirements fairly throw himself away." Great pain. Only a man of Scot's sincerity as a friend could have got away with using a phrase like that without abusing the meaning of words. And when Leiden did go abroad, he went to India as a doctor of medicine soon after this. Scot showed the combination of generosity and insight which lay at the heart of his character. Referring to Leiden's departure, he wrote, "Thus set forth upon his voyage, perhaps the first British traveller who ever sought India, moved neither by the love of wealth nor of power." As a matter of fact, the Governor-General out there, Lord Minto, the chief of your name, sir, and one of the most worthy of them too, as I'm sure you would agree, he said the same thing about Leiden. But by this time, Leiden had proved the truth of those words. Scot had predicted it in advance. Before I leave the subject of this brief but fruitful friendship, I want to tell you what Leiden thought about it. And I should mention that although Scot was 4 years older than Leiden, and of an altogether higher social status, he was not more celebrated than Leiden before the publication of the Border Minstrelsy in 1802 and Leiden's departure for India in the following spring. Leiden was lionized not only in Edinburgh, but in London and Oxford as well. He could take his pick socially, and as we've seen, he fairly did it on his own terms. Neither was he effusive about the people he chose to associate with as a rule. And yet, before he left for India, he addressed Scot in these words. Unfortunately, he's composed it in poetry, and he wasn't a very good poet, but the sincerity of what he's saying, I think, will overcome my embarrassed recital of his lines. O Scot, with whom in youth's serenest prime I wove with careless hand the fairy rhyme, when half deceased, with half the world between, my name shall be unmentioned on the green. When years combine with distance, let me be by all forgot, remembered still by thee. And of course, Scot honoured his request. By the time Leiden died in Java a few years later, Scot had moved into the front rank of British poets with the publication of his Lay of the Last Minstrel and Marmion. And when he came to compose The Lord of the Isles, he included in it the elegiac lines on Leiden, which have been inscribed on Leiden's monument in the centre of Denham Green. Scot knew the area well. William Wordsworth visited him there in the year of Leiden's departure. And Scot took him to see the little school to which Leiden had walked as a child 8 miles from the back of Rubislaw. He had that gift for remembered detail. By this time, of course, he knew hundreds of people in that area. William Wordsworth said that as a friend of Scott's, he might have found a hearty welcome under any roof in the border country. Scott's appetite for life and his genius for friendship produced that marvellous portraiture of lowland peasants, professional townspeople, the aristocracy of town and country. But he only used these as the vehicle for exploring the meaning and the purpose of life. This comes out very clearly in his first novel, Waverley, which, as Goethe so properly remarked, was to be a pointer to everything he would attempt in the future. And what do we find in Waverley? We find a rather immature young man at the time of the last Jacobite uprising who holds a Hanoverian commission. And in spite of that, he is seduced partly by chance, partly by extremely bad judgment, and partly by romantic sentiment into the Jacobite camp, to the grave disadvantage and danger of people for whom he had a responsibility, until it appears that in the end he's going to let down everybody and prove to be one of the disintegrating forces of life. But Waverley redeems himself by falling back on the duties of friendship, irrespective of the conflicting issues by which he's surrounded. He saves the life of Talbot, the Hanoverian officer. He cannot save the life of the Jacobite Highland chief with whom he's formed such an improper association, but he accompanies him as nearly as he can to the scaffold and undertakes the protection of his unfortunate clansmen. Let me go a little further into the principles that animated Scot and which guided him in his search for the meaning of life, because in spite of Carlyle's complaint about the spiritual emptiness of the Waverley novels, I find them to be written with as distinct a moral purpose as any of the writings of Victor Hugo, and that is saying plenty. The difference, I think, is that Scot didn't write from the standpoint of a particular religious orthodoxy. Les Miserables, by contrast, is a sort of modern divine comedy, in which Jean Valjean passes from hell through purgatory until he finally reaches paradise about 3 volumes later. saved by the Christian redemption through the office of the good bishop in an orthodox Catholic context. Scot was noted in his own lifetime for what was described as an absence of religious awareness in a country much given to what I hope I shall be forgiven for describing as a tendency to rigorous outward conformity. For centuries past, his countrymen had lost few opportunities of persecuting one another in defense of rival dogmata, and Scot reacted against this in a manner which set him apart from very many of his fellow countrymen. It became axiomatic to him that the proper aim of mankind is tolerance and forbearance, not tearing one another to pieces over a dogma. And the way in which this began to appear in his novels led to criticisms that seemed to me slightly contradictory. On the one hand, he was accused of being irreligious, and on the other hand, he was subjected to virulent attacks by hardline Calvinists, one by Macri, went to 78,000 words, which amounted really to a charge of heresy, and I think that was more like it. Scot exemplified and preached the Meden Agam of the Greeks, the Buddhist middle way. He abhorred fanaticism and the cruelty and destructiveness to which it gives rise. He found his countrymen especially exposed to extremism, especially disposed to it. In the heart of Midlothian, he observed, the air of Scotland was alien to the growth of independency, however favourable to fanaticism in other forms. And this is by no means the only time when he spoke directly to the reader on the subject rather than leaving the story to make its own point. In Rob Roy, there's that sermon in Glasgow when Scot observed, the Scotch, it is well known, are more remarkable for their intellectual gifts than for the keenness of their feelings. Hence they are more moved by logic and by rhetoric, and more attracted by acute and argumentative reasoning on doctrinal points than by appeals to the heart and to the passions by which the popular preachers of other countries win the favour of their hearers. I remember once hearing a member of the congregation at public worship say in the middle of a sermon, "Stick to your text, man." I'm now trying to avoid a similar reproof. Aha, he's following me on another copy. In Old Mortality, light shone on the subject. In Old Mortality, Scott's supreme statement about the destructiveness of rival fanaticisms. How hard he tries to be fair to the protagonists. The die-hard Calvinists on the one side, the upholders of episcopacy, and an uncovenanted king on the other. Many people have found all that Old Testament ranting in Old Mortality incredibly tedious. But it had been flooding Scotland for a long time, and I dare say Scot was trying to bore his readers out of ever wanting to hear another word of such unedifying rubbish. What he was opposing to its message, and to the vicious backlash of its opponents, was the ethical code to which I've referred already. In place of confrontation, tolerance. In place of violence, reconciliation. Look at some of the magic moments when the light breaks through the dark clouds of that horrifying and, I'm afraid, fundamentally true tale. One of them concerns Bessie McClure, who has seen both her sons killed on the Covenanting side, one of them shot in cold blood right in front of her face. My old een dazzled when the shots were looten off, and my thought they waxed weaker and weaker ever since that weary day. She's left blind and alone, And yet when a wounded officer of Dundee's forces comes to her hut, she takes him in and nurses him back to health. And her neighbours blame her and say she should have killed him as Jael killed Sisera in that remarkable anthology of horror stories. And all Bessie McClure has to remark on the subject is, it wouldn't have brought my Ninian and Johnny alive again. This is one of countless examples of Scott's gift for depicting how little folk get caught up in issues over which they have no control, clinging to standards which cleverer and more powerful people have abandoned, and so helping to hold the fragile framework of civilization and natural humanity from falling apart. Not that he gives humble folk a monopoly of virtue. I'm sure you instantly thought, by contrast, of Cuddy Hedrig in that novel, that altogether plausible character who doesn't object to his mother's Bible thumping because he disagrees with her doctrine, but because it's causing him a lot of material inconvenience. He wants to compromise, not because he has any spirit of compromise, he's trying to look after his skin. How doubt mither, he says to him, ye hae preached an you for 6 days. Ye hae preached us out of our canny free house and our good kale yard and out of this new city of refuge afore our hinder end was we'll hafted in it. Ye hae preached an you for a while. It isn't a heroic philosophy, but Scott invites us to sympathize with it. And even when he introduces Andrew Fairservice to us in Rob Roy, that despicable character, he does so, I think, without unnecessary venom. Although Andrew Fairservice possessed most of the qualities which Scott abhorred. He was disloyal to people to whom he owed a position of trust. He robbed them. He indulged in malicious tittle-tattle about them behind their backs. He was cowardly and divisive. 2 of his careless words cost 2 lives. Do you remember Bailey Nicol Jarvis' reprimand to him? Whisht, sir, whisht. It's ill-scraped tongues like yours that marks mischief atween neighbourhoods and nations. There's nae thing sae good on this side of time, but it might have been better. Incidentally, the Bailey was ticking him off for his anti-English, anti-unionist talk. In Rob Roy, as in Old Mortality, Scott is preaching forbearance and showing how society is held together by the bonds of loyalty, about which we have so rightly been hearing more earlier this evening. He also tells us what the consequences can be of the opposite sort of behavior. Look at the covenanting leader, Burley, who believes that the end justifies the means, who appeals successfully to ties of ancient friendship, and then abuses them in the most deceitful manner. Scott's apt to provide that nemesis, or the law of karma, call it what you will, overtakes all such people before his story is done. Did he believe that it does so in real life, as a matter of course? I've never been able to find any distinct statement of his beliefs about this, and perhaps somebody here can give me guidance. Meanwhile, I probably need guidance, and I shall probably need it any moment now. Let me turn now to the Heart of Midlothian, which is one, I think, of Scott's favourite novels, with all of us, and to the karma of the 2 sisters. Effie Deans, the beautiful, spoilt one, is brought to trial for having concealed the birth of an illegitimate baby, and possibly of having done away with it. There have been far too many cases of this sort, and society must make an example of her if she is guilty. But whether the law convicts and executes her of this particular crime or not, life itself is trying Effie Deans for the faults of character responsible for her behaviour, and particularly for her concealing the birth of that child from her own sister, Jeanie. And although in the end she receives a royal pardon, She cannot be freed from the consequences of her faults. She becomes rich and titled, but always she has to conceal the fact that she's an ex-jailbird living under a royal pardon, using the very subterfuges and deceit which led to her behavior in the first place. I am a liar of 15 years standing, she tells her sister, and must by now be used to my character. It apparently never occurs to her to try and change her character instead of becoming used to it. She's taken elocution lessons in English, but only to increase the falsehood of her position. It's an additional subterfuge, and this comes out most dramatically in that conversation with Jeannie when she makes that remark, because Jeannie, of course, is talking her truth language, her native language, and Effie is speaking to her in her assumed, her falsehood language. What Scot is telling us, I think, is that it's not that sin, mistake, of having that baby, which is her fundamental fault. It is her falseness. Jeannie, her sister by contrast, has an attitude to the truth which, as a matter of fact, has pre-Christian origins in Scotland. Our earliest known code of laws, the Gaelic Brehon Code, was written down in about the 7th century. But it has traces of infinitely older origins going back to the Indo-European past of the Celtic peoples and containing many similarities with Hindu thought. And among these similarities is an attitude to the truth. Both accepted as a proposition that the truth has a magic of its own and can destroy those who flout it. Effie is only saved from such destruction by the efficient grace of the Christian redemption in the Catholic Church. Now, I don't want to suggest to you that I think Jeannie Deans was unable to tell a lie in that memorable court scene in The Heart of Midlothian, because she'd been receiving some sudden Hindu instruction or reading the Brehon Code, which Professor Binchy himself, I think, finds enough to unravel. She is presented throughout the novel as the exemplary product of a devout Calvinist family, although her pious father does hint to her that she might just manage a little white lie to save her sister's life from the witness box. Compare her predicament with that of the nun in Les Miserables. The nun was considered to be an embodiment of the truth, someone incapable of telling a lie. And it is for that reason that she was believed by the police when she told the lie which saved Jean Valjean from arrest. I suppose we could spend the rest of the evening discussing which is the higher morality, but I don't think there can be anybody reading The Heart of Midlothian who doesn't hope that Jeannie is going to be capable of telling a lie like that nun to save her sister. But that little lie is too much for Jeannie. What is comparatively simple for her is to walk alone, on foot, all the way to London, to ask for a royal pardon, if you please. Why should I be afraid of facing royalty, she says. They're human beings with hearts and feelings like our own. This incident is a particularly remarkable example, I think, of Scot's gift for presenting to us the way in which human beings respond, for good or ill, to the influence of others. Queen Caroline is in no mood to grant more royal pardons after the snub she received when she pardoned Captain Porteous for his part in the Edinburgh riots. And Jeannie inadvertently touches on other causes of resentment as well. But she succeeds in implanting her spirit of compassion in the Queen. And how does she overcome all the difficulties and dangers of that journey to London? At every point, she is preserved by the loyalties of friendship. One of these involves the Duke of Argyll, and it's he who takes Jeannie to see the Queen. But most significantly, another person on whom she comes to depend is a man described as formerly the greatest thief and housebreaker in Scotland, whom she's met in the Tolbooth prison when she was visiting Effie, her sister, there. This man tells Jeannie in Crook's language, of which she cannot understand one word, about all the rogues and criminals she's going to meet on the road to London. Jeannie is rather alarmed by him, tries to get away, but he detains her and he scribbles a few lines on a dirty piece of paper and he forces her to take it, saying, if you meet one of these fellows, show him that. The baldest of them will ken a Scot of my goose feather. And so she sets off, armed with all the powers of good, which her character is able to extract from other people. Now, I've been talking about some of the values which Scot presented to us in his novels with consummate art, and which he practiced in his life to the admiration of everybody who knew him. I have observed that, although these, of course, are Christian values, they were practiced and preached by a man who was considered to be something of an indifferent Christian. Indeed, some of his writings constitute an actual indictment of the exclusiveness of the Christian religion, its long record of vicious infighting between rival claimants to the keys of St. Peter, not to mention its appalling record of intolerance to people holding other religious beliefs. Scot asserted the Buddhist doctrine that intolerance is absolutely bad and forbearance is absolutely good. And look at something else he put in the mouth of the antiquary, a man of foreign origins, certainly, but one who was credited with having many of the characteristics of his author. Oldbuck, the antiquary, is reflecting on his intimations that a human being is not so much an entity as a process. And that is a Buddhist interpretation of life. It's at such moments, Oldbuck thinks to himself, that we are aware of the changes of time. The same material objects are before us that we gazed at in wayward childhood and impetuous youth and anxious and scheming manhood. These are permanent and the same. But when we come to look upon them in old age, can we, changed in our pursuits, in our limbs, in our feelings, in our strength, can we ourselves be any longer called the same? Or do we not rather look back with a kind of wonder on our former selves as beings separate and distinct from what we now are? This brings me, as I'm sure you have already anticipated, to the subject of, you haven't, reincarnation. I hope you don't think I'm going in pursuit of snakes in Ireland next. I find that the average Christian has a very open mind to the subject of reincarnation, but very often hasn't given much thought to it. Scott's most direct reference that I happen to have come across in his novels is in Guy Mannering. And here it has an absolutely rational explanation, because Guy Mannering, as you remember, had been carried away from his childhood home so young that he'd lost any conscious recollection of it. And then he knocked about the world, and he'd come in touch with Hindu thought in the course of his travels. And this is how he reflected when he returned to those childhood surroundings which were no longer within his conscious mind. Why is it that some scenes awaken thoughts which belong, as it were, to dreams of early and shadowy recollections, such as my old Brahmin Munshi would have ascribed to a state of previous existence? Is it the visions of our sleep that float confusedly in our memory and are recalled by the appearance of such real objects as in any respect correspond to the phantoms they presented to our imagination? You see why I didn't try and do this by heart. How often do we find ourselves in society which we have never before met? You can see I'm illiterate. And yet feel impressed with a mysterious and ill-defined consciousness that neither the scene, the speakers, nor the subjects are entirely new. Now, despite the rational explanation, you may or may not think that he has still left the door open to Brahmin Munshi's interpretation in that passage. 10 years later, his attitude was still ambivalent, according to an entry which he placed in his journal. Yesterday at dinner, I was strangely haunted by the sense of pre-existence. That is, a confused idea that nothing that passed was said for the first time, that the same topics had been discussed and the same persons had stated the same opinions on the same subjects. It is true there might have been some ground for recollections, considering that 3 at least of the company were old friends. Finally, Scot decides, I think the stomach must have something to do with it, but not before he'd indulged in other speculations. Such thoughts have generally been in the air, whether or not they're within the local religious curriculum. You remember I mentioned that William Wordsworth visited Walter Scott in 1803. This was some years before Wordsworth published the poem, in which you find the lines, "Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar." Did the two poets discuss such things? Now, I'm not trying to suggest for a moment that Scott was guided by a single ethical principle that is not to be found in the Bible. It's equally clear to me that there is not a single Christian precept which is at variance with a Buddhist precept, except through divisive interpretation. It's in our emphasis and our priorities that our attitudes become manifest. Scott undoubtedly attached supreme importance to the precept, "Judge not that ye be not judged, for with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you again. And I will not insult you by reminding you who laid down that rule." It's also a Buddhist precept, and history is absolutely clear as to which of the two religions has attached the higher importance to it in practice. And if Walter Scott's novels contain no other serious purpose, they would stand as an extended series of sermons designed to redress the balance. Outside the novels, he could, of course, speak entirely directly. In his essay on chivalry, he spoke about the indifference to life, which is the usual companion of intolerant zeal. And in his Life of Napoleon, he panned the fanaticism which he said destroyed men's balance, destroyed their judgment, perverted their sense of truth, and ended by destroying their sanity, charity, human compassion. Strong words. By contrast, let me quote you some words that he placed in the mouth of Reuben Butler in The Heart of Midlothian. I think it's very noteworthy that he placed these words in the mouth of a minister of the Established Church of Scotland and the husband of Jeannie Deans. I think he's telling us about his own beliefs. Interpret the passage how you will. Effie Dean's husband, Sir George Staunton, is talking about his fear of death. "We love not to think that we will mix with the ages that have gone before us, as these black raindrops mingle with the waste of waters, leaving a trifling and momentary eddy, and then are lost forever." And Reuben Butler replies, "We cannot be lost forever. Death to us is change, not consummation, and the commencement of a new existence, corresponding in character to the deeds we have done in the body." Now, I've been talking as long as I have about what I take to be the beliefs of Scott as they're to be found in his novels because of that complaint of Carlyle's about the spiritual emptiness of the Waverley novels, and Lockhart's remark about the absence in Scott's life of religious awareness. I know we all have to guard against the temptation to think those people most profound whose opinions agree most nearly to our own. And the same goes, I think, to some extent with our beliefs. What Carlyle's beliefs were, you know. What mine are, you might suspect. the difference between them possibly accounts for the differences in our judgments, though, of course, Scot stands well clear of our partial attitudes. I've chosen all the quotations from his novels to illustrate what I'm saying from those early novels which Scot set for the most part in Scotland within a period of time that extended no more than a century before his own birth. These have always been special favourites of Scot's, containing, as they do, that marvellous set of portraits of people of all walks and condition of life. And the range of those portraits stands out dramatically when one compares them to what you find in Jane Austen. Now, I'm a devoted admirer of Jane Austen, and I'm sure she beats Scot on form. But you must have noticed how in her stories carriages drive up to houses. Great dinners like this one appear on dining tables. People walk about in cultivated gardens and turn up at each other's homes to stay for a month. And all this appears to be done by press-button automation. The armies of servants who presumably made this lifestyle possible are not even patterns on the wallpaper. In Scot's novels, they are among his most significant characters, and I'm specially impressed by his treatment of the horse. When Scot lived, civilization, as it had been for thousands of years, was still based on the association between man and horse, as it was to remain for nearly another century before our beautiful cities, which had been so carefully designed to accommodate that partnership, began to be torn apart to make them accessible to motor vehicles instead. Scot's early illness left him peculiarly dependent on the horse, just as it gave him that early insight into the border peasantry of which he made such effective use, and about which our prize winner, Fiona Mitchell, wrote so beautifully in her essay. Scot never neglected the part which that devoted and patient creature played in the social life of his time, any more than he neglected the part which servants played. His humanity again. Another merit so rightly claimed for these early Scottish novels is that they help to change the attitude to history, not only of ordinary people, but even of historians. A past president of this club, Professor Hugh Trevor Roper, expounded this theme in an address of outstanding brilliance and distinction. On the other hand, Professor Roper did say that it was these Scottish novels, and these alone, which gave Scot his permanent title to fame. Before, as Trevor Roper said, these are his words, he was seduced by his own fancy and caught in the inexorable machinery of his own financial ambitions. And I'm bound to say it's not on those grounds that I have confined my quotations to the Scottish novels. I find those remarks at least as applicable to Shakespeare, if not more so. Shakespeare, too, wrote a fine set of historical dramas, which he placed in his own country, England, mostly in the century preceding that of his own birth. He, too, was seduced by mercenary ambitions to buy a coat of arms, to buy an estate, to keep up with the Ardens. And in pursuit of this goal, wrote all that romantic tushery set in remote times and places at which historians, of course, sneer. King Lear, Hamlet, Othello, Antony and Cleopatra. Macbeth, worst of all, to think that he should have had the effrontery to libel Scotland's earliest historical queen regnant in that manner, and worse still, designated her as though Queen Victoria were designated Lady Albert. But of course, Shakespeare escaped a whipping because he wasn't credited with having invented historical drama, and therefore couldn't be scolded for having moved his plots into times and places with which he was relatively unfamiliar. And the term relatively is the one that matters. Professor Trevor Roper said that the reason why those early Scottish novels were so marvellous is because Scot had an intimate knowledge of the whole of Scotland. It was on this solid basis of knowledge that his great novels were built. Well, I'm sure you all winced when I tried to quote Lowland Scots to you. And I wince when I read most of the speech that Scot places in the mouths of Highlanders. He clearly had considerably less knowledge of Gaelic than he did of either French or Italian, and most of his little snatches of Gaelic are pretty pathetic. And much of the English he places in the mouth of his Highland is not much better. It shows very little knowledge of the way in which a native Gaelic speaker who is using English as a foreign language with an imperfect knowledge of its grammar would express himself. And if his historical picture of France and Burgundy in the 15th century in Quentin Durward is defective, so is his picture of social life in the Highlands in the 18th century. Why, James Bruce of Kinnaird did a lot better writing about Abyssinia, not surprisingly, because Bruce spent longer in Abyssinia and took the trouble to learn the Amharic language and probably several of the other 35 languages of Ethiopia. But of course, Bruce wasn't practicing the art of fiction, although he was accused of doing just that to his extreme annoyance. Does it matter that Scott's picture of social life in the Highlands in the 18th century hasn't the historical truth of, for instance, Rubdown, who gives us the most complete Gaelic record of social life in that century? I don't think it does. As Bailey Nicol Jarvie said, there's naething say good on this side of time, but it might have been better. And that goes for the work of historians as well as novelists. And although Scott invented the historical novel as he went along and altered people's attitude to history, neither of these was his primary purpose. His primary purpose, like Shakespeare's, was to develop a theme, and he's to be judged by whether he developed that theme well or badly, and not by whether he was writing good or bad social history. As it happened, the immediate past in his own country provided a peculiarly apt context for what he wanted to say, because the centuries of conflict between the Gaelic-speaking Highlanders and the Scot-speaking Lowlanders still continued and had been polarized as recently as that in the Jacobite uprisings. Incidentally, I cannot imagine why this is called a conflict between Celt and Saxon, though that was once written above something I had written in a journal, and I wasn't shown the proof, so I couldn't have it cut out. The Highlanders are Celtic peoples heavily infiltrated by Germanic Norsemen. The Lowlanders are Celtic peoples heavily infiltrated by Germanic Angles. Both have received more than a sprinkling of Anglo-Normans, and there are descendants of Flemings and other people like that knocking around. I cannot see whether Saxons come into it, except by a misreading of one of the Gaelic terms for a lowland, Optus Sassanich. The other one, Gaelic, is a better one. It simply means a foreigner. But I don't think the people who apply that term have been doing much Gaelic research. With his preoccupation about the sources of discord and misunderstanding and the way these can be cured by mutual forbearance, Scott naturally returned more than once to such a context. It happened to be in his own country, it happened to be in the century before his birth. This was why he went to that period, not because he wanted to write social history. And such was his influence that another result occurred. He played a major part in producing the synthesis between Highlander and Lowlander, whose most derided manifestation is what has been called the marshalling of the Lowlanders into piped and kilted clans. But what is so laughable about this? The tartan is, as a matter of fact, one of the most remarkable achievements of folk art, or craft if you prefer it, on record. It was not the invention of lowland mechanical looms or things ordained by Highland chiefs as it is today. These intricate little patterns, the width of a small cottage hand loom, that's why the patterns reproduce themselves within about that space, where the achievement of crofters' wives living in thousands of tiny little homes in the Highlands. The bagpipe, which is found in many parts of the world, produced in no other part of the world a musical tradition of such outstanding distinction as it did in the Scottish Highlands. The Lowlanders did well to take over these things. And as for whipping up a clan spirit in the Lowlands, well, it didn't need to be whipped up in the border country. It was there already. Of course, we cannot escape from the august figure of a 60-year-old, 20-stone king prancing around Edinburgh in Highland dress with pink tights to conceal the royal knees. But everybody knew that George IV liked dressing up. He'd been doing it ever since Beau Brummell's time. And I suggest that he was doing it in no worse cause than any of his other charades. As for his inept toast at the banquet in the Parliament House in Edinburgh, I give you simply the chieftains and clans of Scotland, said worthy burgesses of Edinburgh. Perhaps one or two of them forgave him. Well, two is probably an exaggeration. But the part that Scot played in all this shouldn't mislead us into thinking that he was the peddler of an unhistorical and tinselly romanticism. Look at his four Crusader novels. So far from falling for the glamour of chivalry, Scot turned on it one of his deadliest weapons, irony. You probably remember that description of the barbarity of a medieval chivalric tournament in Ivanhoe. Thus ended the memorable field of Ashby de la Zouche, one of the most gallantly contested tournaments of that age. For although only 4 knights, including one who was smothered in the heat of his armour, had died upon the field, yet upwards of 30 were desperately wounded, of whom 4 or 5 never recovered. Several were disabled for life, and those who escaped best carried the marks of the contest to the grave with them. Hence it is always mentioned in our old records as the gentle and joyous passage of arms of Ashby. Scot was not the peddler of tinselly romanticism. He chose to place his plots in different and distant times and places, just as Shakespeare did, to show development of character and the challenges of life. In The Talisman, which Francis R. Hart, a professor in America, who was a great expert on Scot, is described as the most complete of the Crusader novels, you find that the theme is the same. It's his eternal preoccupation. It is the conflict between the forces of disintegration and those of reconciliation. And I think he did well to allow the Muslim to hand the healing talisman to Europe as a gift, because at that time, Arabic surgery and medicine was far in advance of that of Europe, so that Christian crusaders used to ask in an emergency for an Arabic doctor. And so much more tolerant and humane was Saladin than any of the people opposing him, that he used to send such a doctor, and he was so tactful as to send a Christian Arab when he could. Now, there's one theme that I haven't mentioned, and which I notice it's almost impossible to talk about Scot without mentioning, not only because it looms in all his novels. It is the effective power of courage. In The Fair Maid of Perth, it moves into the center of the story as the central theme. And I can never forget the compassion with which Scot presents to us in that story a man who lacks courage, the timid lover who says to the Lowland priest, "I have no heart to be a martyr. I have never in my whole life had courage enough to snuff a candle with my fingers." We all agree that Scot's supreme record of courage is his own journal. And it too moves to the center of the stage at the time when Scot is facing ruin. It is a bitter thought, but if tears start, let them flow. My heart clings to the place I have created. There is scarce a tree that does not owe its being to me. What a life mine has been, rich and poor 4 times over, once on the verge of ruin, yet opened a new source of wealth almost overflowing, now to be broken in my pitch of pride. And then his reaction when that ruin became a reality. His resolve to pay his creditors every penny he owed them. I will be their vassal for life, and dig in the mine of my imagination to find diamonds or what may sell as such, to make good my engagements. Then the next blow, his wife's death. They are arranging the chamber of death, that which was long the apartment of connubial happiness, and whose arrangements, better than in richer houses, she was so proud. They are treading thick and fast. The meeting at Abbotsford the following Hogmanay. We meet like survivors of some perilous expedition, wounded and weakened ourselves, and looking through diminished ranks to think of those who are no more. And the iron resolve sustained to the end, so that when he was given a social invitation, when he was no longer fit to work, he replied, I must home to work while it is called day. For the night cometh when no man can work. I put that text many years ago on my sundial, but it often preached to me in vain. To this man who had the courage even of his uncertainties, where he remained uncertain, who spoke so clearly and persuasively about the riddles of life that he thought he did have an answer to, who transcended so many of the deficiencies in the human character and exemplified so much to which we most aspire. To the memory of this wonderful man, I now invite you to drink a toast. To the memory of Sir Walter Scott.